各位远道而来的朋友，大家早哈！还有我们这个来自于全台湾各地的不管是学术界或者是在工作的伙伴上面从事家庭教育的一些好姐妹、好朋友，大家早安！今天其实我很荣幸能够来这边来介绍这个Dr.Scott Stanley。那其实早上我有跟他谈了一下，我说很抱歉，我们大概都是用中文来介绍。他说对呀，如果早一点让他知道，他就会讲中文，他就跟大家一样，就不需要讲英文哈，让大家还要翻译。所以我们下次应该提早让他知道，这样子他就可以讲中文了哈。好，因为昨天呢，其实易老师呢已经介绍Dr.Scott Stanley 很详细，所以我今天不会再重复介绍很多，但是因为这是我的责任，所以还是要简单的介绍他一下in case 有一些同伴你们今天比较第一次来的时候呢，可以了解他的一些背景。那同时呢，我也让大家知道一下说，今天这个主题最主要为什么要谈这样子的一个主题哈。好，那首先我很简单的介绍一下他的一些背景。他目前呢是在美国丹佛大学，同时呢，其实他担任的这个主要的科系呢，跟我们大家都很有相关的，就是婚姻与家庭学系的教授。那他本身呢也是婚姻与家庭研究中心的主任，同时呢，他也执行一个非常重要的计划。那这个计划是在美国里面 PREP 的一个主要的一个计划在执行。那他们的成果也相当不错。其实今天他就要呈现这个计划的部分的内容，让我们知道。那这样子的一个计划，其实它也是结合一些政策跟他的研究出来的结果。所以我们也很希望未来我们在不管是学术界或者是我们政府都能够结合相关的研究作为基础来发展我们的一些策略。好，Scott Stanley 他本身的一个研究领域里面呢，其实也包括了一些我们常常在这个领域家庭领域里面提到的婚姻品质、离婚、亲子关系，还有一些心理压力跟福祉这样的一些课题。我想大家对于这样子的一个要给我们带来一些新的 information 的一个讲者来讲，大家应该都不会很陌生，因为我们在这个领域大概都读到他一些相关的 paper， 所以我今天是非常荣幸来这边介绍他哦。其实我想大家会在安排我来介绍的时候，大概也考虑到一个因素，什么因素呢？其实他今天要讲的主题呢是什么呢？是跟军人有关。那我本身是军人的子弟，其实从小到大，我本身呢就已经看到我爸爸妈妈他们在承受家庭上面的一些压力，说实在真的是高风险哈。我从小到大一直在搬家，因为随着爸爸需要，所以我们一直在搬家。我必须要建立新的朋友，一直在学习建立新的朋友。我妈妈也是一样，好不容易跟一些邻居建立好的关系，接着又要建立一些新的 network， 所以其实他们的一些朋友的 support 常常必须要改变。我觉得这也是一个值得让我们学习的地方，尤其在国内针对这样子的议题去了解的并不多。或许未来我觉得还可以考虑的是，如果我的父母亲是军人，对小孩的影响在哪里？其中一个影响就是 marriage， 为什么？因为我妈妈不准我嫁给军人，这个影响，或许我们未来可以了解一下。如果是军人的子弟，他是不是他的小孩也会受到一些影响哈？因为我妈把我原来有一个不错的对象，其实还没有谈到这个恋爱哈，但是呢，因为在那个过程当中，我妈妈没收所有她寄来的信，所以我完全不知道。因此，我妈妈很明白的告诉我，她反对我继续交往。那这样子的过程为什么呢？因为她觉得她在这个婚姻当中承受很大的压力，她不希望她的女儿再去面对。所以呢，接下来我就把时间交给我们今天的主角人Scott Stanley， 然后让他来介绍这样子的一个高风险家庭如何透过一些方式，然后让他的家庭减少他的风险。让我们大家请把你的双手举起来，欢迎他。
Good morning. 大家好。Okay, that's I'm going to talk this morning about the work that we have done in the military, and I'm also going to talk, kind of give an update of research in the field of studying couple, marriage, relationship education. So there are many studies now in a number of different countries, many of them in the US, but there's some also good studies done in other parts of the world that give us knowledge, give us insight about how able we are to be effective in terms of helping couples to do better in their marriages and their relationships, and also what challenges lay before us, what is difficult. And today what I'll do in particular, since we're talking about the military couples in this talk, there'll be a number of things that I can talk about in terms of higher risk groups and how research looks when we do these things with higher risk versus lower risk couples. And then I will talk about some variations of high and low risk that other studies have found results on as well. So not just about the military, but about some other types. I want to say at the start two things, just foundationally. One is this particular research project that I'll say the most about today is a well-funded study by the United States government, by the National Institutes of Health, and particularly the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. It's a pretty expensive study, although there's a couple others that are much more expensive even than this one that I'll comment on before I'm done. And also, whenever I talk about results of research that's on our program PrEP, I always make sure that the audience knows that me and my colleague Howard and Galena Rhodes and other colleagues of ours do derive some income from the program, so people know that we have a financial interest as well when they think about what we're saying about the program. Fortunately, in the case of PrEP, there's probably more studies by other researchers than ourselves on variations of our program than any other program that's ever existed. So it's not always just us doing the research on our program, many other people have. So I'm happy to say that. This is an army dog. No, yeah, this is my dog, Odie. And I thought I would just say a little bit about Odie to start off. Why relationship education? Why do we care to try to help people strengthen their relationship? And many of you that know me well know that I love metaphors and analogies. I think of them easily. They come to me all the time. Sometimes they come to me during a talk. And this is one of my favorite ones of all time. So this is my dog, Odie. And this is a picture that I took of him the very first night we had him when he was a puppy. So this was the first night in our home. He weighed 4 pounds at the time. Now he's a giant brute at 18 pounds. He was this big, now he's this big. Cute little ball of fluff. And the main point I want to say as a metaphor, just putting the picture of Odie up here, and it's important for all couples, in terms of couples that start romantically. Everybody knows this experience. Excuse me. You fall in love with the front end of the puppy, but every puppy has a back end, right? And the front end in that metaphor is the easy part. It's easy to fall in love. It's almost automatic. We fall in love, and then once we're in love, initially, all the chemistry in the body and in the brain participates in making us feel euphoric, and we feel happy, we feel distressed if we're not near this person we've fallen in love with. All this chemistry, as well as the psychology and all the other kind of connection we have with this person, that's the easy part of relationships. That's the part that doesn't take a lot of work. The part that takes more work, in this case, in the case of the puppy, is the back end. In fact, if you think about this metaphorically, at least in the United States, I don't know how it is here, when people get a pet, when people get a dog or a cat, especially this is true with dogs, if it doesn't work out, if they end up returning the dog, if they end up taking the dog back to where they got the dog, or giving the dog back to whoever gave them the dog, it's never because, they don't give it back and say, it's not cute anymore. Don't like the front end anymore. It's not, you know, it's always about the back end. Because if you think about, I won't get too detailed here, by the way, but if you think about the back end of the puppy, that's where the work of the relationship is. That's where you have to figure out, how do we do this? How do we do this? Where do you go? When do you go? How do we figure out how we know when you need to go? All those are the kinds of things that are also very important in relationships, that work of how we handle things, how we handle the stuff of life. Because if we don't handle the back end well, the front end can't stay cute enough. There can't be enough positive if the negative parts or the more difficult or challenging parts of the relationship don't work. So that's my metaphor with ODI. Now, PREP stands for the Prevention and Relationship Enhancement Program. It's an educational curriculum for strengthening marriages. We've been working on it since around 1980. It's extensively researched with lots of different variations, lots of different groups, as I said, different research teams, fundamentally developed by Howard Markman and me and many other colleagues over the years. It would be a long list of names to mention if I started down that path. So we have about a 30-year plus research history and about a 20-year plus history, particularly with the armed forces, which I will explain, because we started working with them fairly early. Within the armed forces in the U.S., there's two groups that we've worked with a lot over the years in the military, and especially the first one. Chaplains. Now, I don't even know if this is true in Taiwanese military forces or how many countries around the world have this. It's true. But in the United States, there are chaplains that serve along with the service members in all the branches of the military. Some chaplains are actually embedded within units, so they're always with the unit. They deploy with them, they go into combat with them, they're always there to offer comfort, give advice, to help out. They counsel couples on many soldiers, airmen, sailors. They help the service people in many, many different ways. And they tend to be very trusted. Not by everybody, because not everybody wants to talk to a chaplain or see a chaplain, but a lot of the service people trust them a great deal. And in the U.S. military, one of the advantages the chaplains have is it's the person that a service person can talk to about almost anything, without any recrimination, without any negative consequence. If they're scared, if they're concerned, if they're worried about something, if they're struggling with something, they can tell the chaplains when maybe they would never tell their sergeant or the lieutenant or somebody else. That wouldn't be safe. The other group in the military that we've worked a lot with is family advocacy, and that name in the military services in the U.S. is really the folks that work on the prevention of higher risk problems, especially domestic violence, but they also work in other family related kinds of risk in terms of family abuse and other kinds of things. But their big focus, and they tend to have a lot of money for services, is in the prevention of domestic violence, or what to do when there's been domestic violence. Back to chaplains. We have worked the most through chaplains, although interestingly, some of what we've done in the history of the U.S. has been very interesting. For example, we started especially working a lot with the Navy in 1990 forward. And through the 90s, one of the things that happened that was fascinating is the chaplains had more time to do this kind of work, to do relationship education with couples. And the family advocacy people didn't really have much time to do the work. They were so busy handling the crises and other kinds of things they did. But they had a much bigger budget. So the people, the domestic violence side had a much bigger budget. And over time, they actually worked very well together. The family advocacy folks in many settings were providing some of the funding for the chaplains to get the training and to get the materials and to provide the services to couples, because they considered that as a valuable and important part of their overall mission, which was to prevent really negative things from happening with the couples. So, but chaplains have a very strong kind of relationship and role. And one of the things that's been very good about working with chaplains, I actually won't cover those points yet, let me still say one more thing about chaplains, is they're a very unique and important kind of provider, which you could think about anything you try to do here in Taiwan. We've talked about my metaphor of tracks and trains and all the different kinds of services and the different groups you could get to. I'm using chaplains as an example. I'm not saying that in many different settings it would be a different person, a different kind of background, a different sort of training, a different maybe expertise or connection with the people. The point I want to extract from chaplains as an example is the best person, whatever setting you're talking about, whoever you're trying to reach, the best person to actually do the services, to do the relationship education kind of work, if that's what we're talking about at the moment, is somebody that's trusted and who knows well these people and what they're going through. So you can see in the military service in the US, the chaplains are ideal because they're deeply embedded with the service people and they know what they're going through and they experience the same things. In all different kinds of settings in that metaphor of tracks and trains, it would be somebody different. It might be this kind of person or this sort of person, but the key is that they need to care. They need to be trusted by the people that they're working with, and they need to, this is really important, they need to understand the people that they're working with. What are their experiences? What do they struggle with? What are their stresses? What is their culture? They don't have to be from the same background. They don't always have to be the same cultural background or have had the same experiences, but they have to understand them well. Otherwise, they'll use examples that don't fit. They'll tell stories that are not quite connecting with the audience. But if they really know the people well and what they go through and they're trusted, then they could be most helpful. So in the military in the US, there's been a long-standing awareness that how families are going affects how well that the service person can do their work. If things are very stressful at home, if they're having lots of trouble in the marriage, or there's great concerns about a child, or there's something else going on in the family, you'll have a service person that's distracted from their work, from their mission, from their training, from what they're supposed to do. Similarly, in the US, of course, as you all know, with recent history in the world, over the last, well, since 9/11, 2001, our military in particular has been strenuously involved in many places around the world. And what that means is our service people have undergone an unprecedented number of deployments, especially to Afghanistan and Iraq, where many of these families that we work with, they may have been through 4 or 5 deployments where the service person has gone away for 9 months or a year and then returned for 6 to 9 months and then gone away again for 9 months or a year and then returned. That's, at least for United States history, there's never been anything like that. World War II, for example, most men in the US served in World War II, but when they went, they didn't come back till the war was over. They were just there, and many of them were younger, didn't have families or things like that. Many had girlfriends, but not families. That was a very different thing. Here, there's this stress of going and coming and going and coming, and then from the family's experience, the soldier or airman or sailor is gone for a while. It could be the woman, by the way, now. Much more often still the man, but about 15% of the time for couples, it's the female. But one of the parents is gone now. One of the 2 people of this family is gone and one's back. In our particular sample that I'll talk about, or no, in the Army in particular, I think about half of the soldiers are married and have families, and about half are single. So this dynamic of the stress for the families, of course, is much greater for the half with the families. We started, as I said, with the Navy, training chaplains and social workers in 1989. Our material was used throughout the Navy and the Marine Corps, which is attached to the Navy, through the 1990s, and as I mentioned, often funded by the Family Advocacy Group, but with the services delivered by chaplains. Air Force started doing a lot more with us in around 1993, and that continued through the 90s. And then in the mid-1990s, the Army chaplains started to use PrEP a lot, with wide use really beginning in the Army in a much more systematic way in about 2001. So our materials have been used throughout the military for a long time and extensively in the Army over the last 10, 12 years in a particular program that I'll describe to you. So one of the initiatives of the Army Chaplain Corps in the United States military is what they call the Strong Bonds program. And Strong Bonds is a large initiative of providing services to couples in the Army. And in fact, they started very small in 2001, 2002. This started as a fairly small effort, relatively speaking. And now it has grown to probably the largest part of the budget of the Chaplain Corps is to provide these services. Part of why the budget is large is, and they may have to cut back now with money getting tighter, but what they've tried to do most often is a very, very strong model where couples come in for a day, and then they came in like a week and a half later for a weekend retreat. Increasingly, they've just been doing the weekend retreats. Budget-wise, they may end up just doing the one-day things here and there, but a lot of money they've put into providing these couples that have been through so much with these weekend retreats to come and also get the relationship education. So, and they would try to pick a nice hotel and give people a very nice experience with a banquet on Friday night, with a bit of training Friday, then some training on Saturday, some time off, and then training Sunday morning. That's been a very strong model, but it's also a very expensive model because of the hotels and the banquets and the child care. They provided funds for child care services for people also so that they could do that. The actual relationship education part that they do, for example, PrEP is one of the programs that they use within that, is really very much less expensive than those other parts of the service. And now they're, with budgets tightening, they're figuring out what they'll do going forward, but it's been a very strong model, and the couples have liked it a lot. It's been very popular. People like to do these retreats. People have enjoyed these services. Now, PrEP is one of the curricula, it's one of the training programs that's used within Strong Bonds. So there's several different curricula developed by different teams that have different characteristics, different flavors, if you will, that are used throughout the Strong Bond program. PrEP is really kind of the flagship one that they've used, but then there's many others that they use as well that are popular with the chaplains as they're doing the services. So what I'm going to talk about now in terms of research is PrEP for Strong Bonds, which is the use of PrEP within the Strong Bonds initiative. We did a preliminary study that was actually funded by the Chaplain Corps. This was a much smaller study in 2000 and 2001. In fact, we were just starting the study in terms of collecting data when 9/11 happened, and the very first large group that we were going to collect data from was the 10th Mountain Division, which is stationed in New York, the state of New York. And that was the very first group that was sent to Afghanistan after 9/11 in terms of what the U.S. did in response to 9/11. We lost a lot of our research participants that way because that's who we were working with first, and they weren't going to wait for our study to go off and be deployed. So in that initial study, though, we worked with lots of different units. We got data through the chaplains from lots of different services they provided around the world from different installations. And we found some promising outcomes. This was very simple, though, not a rigorous design. The participants were very satisfied with the program, with the services, generally positive effects from pre to post. So this was a short-term study, getting positive effects on communication and handling conflict, confidence in the relationship, things like that. And that we were able to, for some part of the sample, get a 30-day follow-up, not real long, but helped from just having pre-post data, that those gains were maintained, and often actually you could see the gains still increasing 30 days later from what they were at post. But lots of limitations, no control group, brief follow-up time, and relatively very inexpensive study compared to the next one. One of the things that we did ask, because we work a lot with chaplains and they were interested in things like this, one of the things we asked is, in terms of different kinds of officers that soldier families were aware of, who did they feel cared the most or was most concerned about how their family was doing? And this isn't really a surprising result. This makes a lot of sense, but it was nice to sort of see the finding that compared to non-commissioned officers and regular duty officers and higher officers, by far and away, as the chaplains that the couples felt the closest to, felt that those are the leaders in our military that care the most about us, and had that kind of connection, which again just goes to say that's a very good group then to be working with the couples, because they like them, they feel like these people care about our families and about how we're doing, in addition to caring about our military performance and our duty. So they've been a very good provider for these kinds of services. As I mentioned, they're trusted, they're close, they understand, and this is always the best question to ask. Who's the best person to carry this message to this group? It'll be all kinds of different people. And that's what we've also been experiencing in the United States. There's many different kinds of people that have been very effective at getting to this group or this group and communicating with them. Now what I'm going to describe is a much larger, very rigorous, much more expensive study of prep for strong bonds in the Army that we've been conducted. This is the study that I mentioned a bit ago that's funded by the National Institute of Health. In this study, we have 662 Army couples across 2 sites, 478 at Site 1, which is really the main site for the study, and 184 couples at Site 2, which was a secondary site. I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute, but that becomes a very important part of what I'm going to discuss in terms of findings and also characteristics of the couple and the results. We assess them every 6 to 9 months, and we've been following them for 5 years now. So we've been following this sample for a long time through all of these things they've been experiencing them. Attrition and non-response rate is very low. We generally have been very good at getting people back in at each follow-up. And I'm going to say a lot this morning about findings related to divorce. And one of the really important things about this study is the 2-year findings that I'll get to in a few minutes. We know this outcome for all but one of those 662 couples, which is a very is an incredible thing for this kind of study. Usually you lose track of people and you don't know how they're doing, and you can't analyze them and the outcome, and it makes it harder to know what the results actually are. In this particular study, what the version of the program that the people got was what I described earlier, where they can come on, let's say, a Thursday, and the soldier would be released from duty that day to be able to come. They can't compel the spouse to come, of course, but very much encouraged to come, and so the couple would come, maybe it's a Thursday, and then a week and a half later on that next weekend, weekend after the coming weekend, they would come in for this weekend retreat. So that's the model that we tested here, which involved about 14 hours of training in communication skills, strategies for preserving fun and friendship, some ideas about forgiveness and what forgiveness is and what it isn't, and how to be forgiving in your marriage, commitment, support, and what I really mean there is emotional support. You know, really how to be more supportive of each other and listen to each other and care for each other about the stresses and strains in life. I increasingly think that's one of the most important things that we are focusing on in what we do. We didn't used to focus a lot on it, and we put a lot of attention on it now. Issues about handling deployments and returning from deployments, so we cover those things for them. So that's and a number of things as well, but that's the main sort of things that we cover. In this sample, the average age is 28. The average couple's been married for 7 years. Mostly in this sample, male active duty, 97%. We do have about 4% in the sample where both are active duty, so they both serve. You can imagine how challenging that might be, especially if there's a child when they're both in the military. The U.S. does try, in the military at this point, they try to make that workable for families, they try to get people stationed as close as possible together. I'm not even sure quite how they handle that related to deployments, but you know, occasionally it probably happens that both must deploy at the same time, and then children must probably go and stay with the family or something like that with their parents. We've had a lot of deployments in this sample, so 79% had one prior to the first time point, and we've had another 72% have a deployment within the last, within 2.5 years of the first time point. And many of them are just finishing up, some of them are just finishing up a deployment now and probably won't be deployed again for a while. Now, the program, this study has two characteristics that make it valuable scientifically in the U.S., so it becomes a useful study for two reasons. I'm focusing on the first one today, which is the program evaluation side. So the main focus of the study is to really evaluate the effectiveness of Prep for Strong Bonds and see how people do over time based on whether they got the program or not. There's also a very valuable side of the study for the basic science of just learning more about how things are affecting these couples. How does the deployment affect couples? How do people communicate when they're deployed? Is more communication better? Is it depend on how well they're getting along? Is more communication worse if they're not getting along well? How do they deal with symptoms of PTSD as when the soldiers come back and they have increased symptoms perhaps from combat exposure? How do they deal with those symptoms of increased alertness and suspiciousness and startling easily and being more irritable, these different kinds of things that are associated with exposure to trauma and exposure to combat and high danger. So we can look at all these kinds of things related to couple characteristics and examine them over time in the basic science part of what we do in this study. The outcomes reported here, I'm going to talk about 1 year and 2 years. Everything I talk about at 1 year is already published, and the outcomes I'm going to share about 2 years are under review right now at a journal. And I must say they've been under review for I'm waiting to hear from them since January, so that's a very long time to wait to hear from the journal. So I'm eager to see the feedback. All the analyses that I'm just going to describe findings, so I'm not going to present a lot of math or anything, but the analyses that we're doing are what's called intention to treat analyses, which means you analyze people based on whether they're randomized to receive the intervention or not, whether or not they actually receive the intervention. So the most rigorous kind of program evaluation that you can do, you recruit everybody that you're interested that fits the characteristics of who you want to test and how you want to see how they do related to the services. And then you completely by random choose who gets the program and who doesn't get the program. They have no choice about whether they get the program or not. When they're recruited into the study, they know this. They're told all this. This is all very clear and made very clear to them that you're agreeing when you come in to participate in this study. We're going to ask you to fill out questionnaires and tell us many things about your relationship for years to come. And roughly half of you will get chosen to participate in this relationship education program, and the other half of you won't. Now, we can't stop the other half from seeking services at some other point, though early on in this study, only a couple of those couples did. So the control group is pretty much not having gotten these services, especially in the earlier phases here of what I'm talking about. And of those that were chosen to get the services, I forget the exact percentage, I should know it, but it slips my mind. But let's say about 82, I think it's about 82%, don't hold me to that, something like that, participated substantially in the services. But some, for them, something about their duty, something about what was going on in their life got in the way and they weren't actually able to participate in the services. In this kind of analysis, this is the most conservative kind of analysis you can do in this kind of work. You always preserve the random assignment and you always analyze people according to the randomization no matter what, because otherwise there's selection characteristics that get involved in who ends up in which group, and you don't want to have those involved in your interpretation of the findings. It's a complex point, but this is the most rigorous kind of analysis you can do. At site 1, from pre to post, you see at the top there, I'm going to just mention some pre to post findings. There was a number of kinds of changes, mostly modest, but a number of things that were statistically significant. And I should also clarify, for those of you that aren't used to statistics, statistically significant doesn't necessarily mean it's a large difference. It means that it's not likely to have happened by chance. It means that it's probably real. It's a real finding and not just happened to be this way or happened to be that way. But something can be statistically significant and still be small or large in terms of how much impact it's having on somebody. These are relatively modest impacts from pre to post that are statistically significant on how they're communicating, the sense of positive bond with my partner, positive attitudes about sacrificing. There's a lot of things we measure. These are just a sample of some of the outcomes. And confidence in the future of the relationship. Do I feel like we can handle things? Do we feel like we can do what we need to do to make our family work? At the second site, we only have significance from pre to post on the communication skills. So right after the training, we can see that they're reporting that they're communicating better than they were beforehand, but we don't see those other changes. You'll see the same difference about divorce findings in a minute between the sites. At 1 year out, what we analyzed was the number of people who had either completed a divorce or had filed for a divorce. So they'd already gone so far as to file for a divorce, because most of those people are going to end up divorcing. Other times couples separate for a while and many of those get back together, some of them end up divorcing. So we decided we would make the outcome really clearly focused on filed for divorce or actually divorced by year 1, and then I'll get to year 2 in a minute. And what you see here is this was a very strong kind of finding in this sort of study. In fact, findings related to divorce and breakup in this field are rare. Usually, they're rare for a number of reasons. One is many studies don't go out long enough to measure that, and many studies have a lot of attrition in the sample where you lose track of people and you can't measure these things well, even if the study goes on for a while. If you can't find a lot of the people to continue to measure, that affects your ability to get this kind of finding. But it also probably is a very difficult outcome to actually achieve. It's easier to get changes on things like communication skills, and in meta-analyses, which are analyses of many studies like this, where they analyze them all together, you can see changes in relationship quality and other kinds of things. But it's harder to get this kind of finding. And in that first site, that larger site, which is the main site for the study, at 1 year out, the couples that took PrEP had 1/3 the odds of divorcing of the couples that were in the control group. And you'll notice in the other site, there was no significant difference at time 1. That's not significant, even though there were actually a couple more couples that divorced there in the PrEP group than in the control group. That's not statistically significant, which means it's just sort of noise. If you do combine all those numbers together, the overall difference across both sites is the 2.3 versus 4.7. So if you looked at it that way, it's about cutting the divorce rate in about a half at the 1 year point. At 2 years, now I have to say, I guess I don't have to say, but I will say, I really thought this 1 year finding was the best finding we would ever get from this sample. I did not expect it to still be there at 2 years because, and this is really important to have realistic expectations. When you do prevention work, when you do relationship education work, and you're meeting with people for 8 hours or 4 hours or 12 hours, maybe you have 6 Tuesday night meetings or something like that, and people come most of the time. That would be very successful, by the way. You don't expect, for some couples, you can get effects that might last the rest of their life because you change something for them at a critical moment. You're working with them at a high-risk time and you help them get through a really difficult time. And once they're on the other side of that difficult time, they're okay. And they're going to be okay now because you helped them through that difficult time. There are a lot of other couples that they have high risks to start. They are struggling to start. Maybe they had difficult family history. Maybe they have always had trouble communicating well, even when they were first in love. So even when they had the front end of the puppy part, the back end was difficult right from the start as well. That's true for many couples. And it's realistic to realize that you can get really good preventive effects, but they may disappear in 2 years in terms of the effects. And you might need to figure out how to keep working with people, how to keep having them involved in things. You know how you get inoculations, shots that keep you from getting a certain kind of disease like polio. Polio is a good example where it's pretty much, it's not disappeared from the world, but it's largely disappeared from the world. People get some vaccine for polio when they're very, very young, and that protects them the whole rest of their life. But there's other kinds of vaccinations that you get, and I don't know what you get here versus what we get in the US, but there's certain ones, you have to get them every 5 years, or every 8 years, or every 10 years to continue to have that resistance to that illness. And this sort of work is much more like that kind of vaccination than the kind that you could get and you're good forever. Now, at 2 years, I didn't expect this, and I was delighted to see it, frankly. When we get around to the 3-year analyses, which we haven't done yet, I don't expect it there either. But one of my graduate students, who's very smart, has a very good theory of why he thinks it's still going to be there. But I haven't looked yet, and I don't want to look until this paper's published. But you can see here at Site 1, there's still this difference. And now it's actually, many more people are involved now. It's getting to be, I didn't put the numbers there, but you know, there's many more divorces by this time. In fact, 11%, that's 11% of the sample from Site 1 is divorced by this 2-year time point. And you can see that that's about half the rate of divorce in the group that got PrEP versus the other group. Still at the other site, not significant. There's not very many divorces at that site. Only 5% of the couples in the second site have gotten divorced, and there's not a significant difference there. Although if you do combine them again, overall, that is that's a significant difference as well. Now, a few things I want to talk about. One overall, and then I'm going to talk about a few things specifically related to risk versus high risk versus low risk. So what we see now, 2 years out, we have this very strong, and this is a really impressive finding. This is very unusual in this field to see such a clear finding 2 years later on an important outcome like divorce. But there is not significant differences in marital quality in those other kind of variables at 2 years. The control group's not happier or communicating better, but they're not less happy or communicating worse. And this is a very complex point at the bottom I won't describe because I want to get onto some other things for sake of time. But I'll just say in the history of this kind of work, you don't often see a study where you get one or the other, where you get both of those kind of findings really strongly in the same sample. Where you get both a difference in stability of the couples and the families and a continuing difference in the quality. And just to make this point super briefly, the problem with this in this kind of study is the fact that many more of the unhappy couples are breaking up and leaving the control group makes the control group otherwise look better over time in terms of relationship satisfaction. So it gets hard to get the other outcome if you have a strong finding on this outcome. At least that's the theory. It's a very challenging problem to solve in terms of analyses. So now I really want to talk about high risk versus low risk, and I'm going to give you 3 examples from this study and then a couple other examples quickly. There's 4 kinds of ways that couples at higher risk seem to be doing better if they get the PrEP program, whereas it's not as important for the couples at lower risk. First one is this difference between Site 1 and Site 2. So I mentioned Site 1 was the initial main site. In fact, Site 1 was really going to be the whole study. And then we got the opportunity, the chaplain corps said, well, hey, we have this other group that could provide these services and participate in the study as well. Would you like to get this other sample? And we said, sure. Not really, this sample's not been nearly as useful to us. part of the reason is there's two very big differences between these sites, and the first one is the one I think that matters, and it relates a lot to risk. Site 1, I won't mention the actual installation, but is a very combat-oriented, combat-heavy, exposed group. So it's not only the largest group in our sample, they have been repeatedly deployed and they have had a lot of combat exposure. It's a frontline combat unit in the US that's used a lot when there's trouble around the world. Site 2, there's certainly people in there that have had a lot of exposure to combat and all, but Site 2 is much more of a training focused site. There's not as much large teams that work together and deploy together. And as I said, Site 2 just is much lower risk because they have half the divorce rate at year 2. That's just one of the examples of why we know they're at lower risk. The other difference is Site 2, the services were delivered by installation chaplains, not by the unit chaplains. And it's possible that it was most effective to have the services delivered by that person that was closest to the couples. This study can never tell the difference now between those two explanations because they're just baked into the cake now, if you will. But it could be one or both. I think the first point is the most important point, that they're much more stressed, much more exposed to combat. They're also a little younger, they're a little lower ranking, so in many ways I think Site 1 is higher risk, and we think that's why we got the bigger effect there. Now, so this is that effect put in the bar chart in terms of the divorce rate being much lower for the PrEP group. Now, a second kind of high and low risk factor is historically in the United States, even though this is less true in the military, but historically in the United States, minority groups, especially African Americans and Hispanics, have higher family risks than Caucasians in the United States. So that was one thing that we wanted to look at here to see if we would get a difference. This is a whopping difference. This is an amazing finding. What this means is for the Caucasian couples, they were a little less likely to divorce if they've got PrEP. But if you're a minority couple and where we define that there is either one or both were a member of a minority in the US, almost 4 times lower the odds of divorce by 2 years if you took the PrEP program. This is a stunning and amazing kind of finding. And this held no matter how I looked at, you could analyze this many ways, and it held in many different ways. And I just want to comment, there's been, these are the three, this project in the Army, and then there's 2 other studies that have some controversial results. I may say something real briefly about them in a few minutes, but I think I'll run out of time. But in all 3 of these are the 3 largest completely randomized trials in the history of relationship education. And in all 3 of these studies, minority couples did the best, which is another example of the higher risk group doing better. Also in the Army sample, just mentioned briefly, the couples at time 1 when the study started that had already had some history of infidelity in their relationship, at least out to 1 year, I don't think we've checked this out to 2 years, but out to 1 year, they got the largest benefit from participating in the program. So they clearly had already had a risky relationship and had something happen that had been, could have ended the whole relationship, very threatening to the relationship. Those couples also benefited the most. And then there's other findings about risk. This isn't in the Army study. So this is from research in Australia where they found in a couple of different studies, Kim Halford and colleagues now, that those who have a particular risk pattern where either the parents have divorced or the parents had a high conflict marriage, they get the most benefit from participating in this kind of relationship education for couples. So those sort of family background risks did the best. And then also in the Army study, the couples that report having the greatest economic stress got the most benefit. So those that feel, we didn't get this finding on actual income. We got this finding on how stressed do you feel about being able to pay your bills. Do you have enough money each month to pay your bills, to buy what you need to buy for your family? Those who reported greater economic stress also got greater benefit. Now, I do want to make this point about the high risk thing, the high risk kind of phenomena. There are a lot of studies now in our field that show that the higher risk groups get more benefits. The thing that's not so consistent, though, is while that finding comes up a lot, there's different kinds of risks in different studies that come up as the group that gets the most benefit. It's not always the same. The one that's seeming to me to start to be somewhat consistent is this one about the minority couples, because again, several large studies have shown that. But different studies find a different risk variable, so we need a lot more research there. We generally know that high-risk folks will do the best with such services, but it could be a different kind of risk in a different kind of group that's related to getting the most benefit. I want to comment now, before I wind up in a few minutes, about some general findings in the field. So those are all findings related to this work in the military. Overall, when you look at all the research that's been done in relationship education, and there's many meta-analyses now which are studies of studies, so they analyze the findings of many other studies all in one set of analyses. Alan Hawkins and colleagues at BYU, University in Utah, have done a lot of these analyses. Overall, there's consistent evidence of getting positive impacts. However, they're often modest. They're not large impacts, but they're consistently positive impacts. As I said, people at higher risk, if there's going to be some difference, the higher risk group almost always will do better. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but that's almost always true. And it's also true, though, it's very difficult in the field of doing this work scientifically to exactly prove or show why something's working. It's easier to show whether something's working or not than to be able to show this is it. It's this part right here. They do this, they get better. If they don't do that, they don't get better. That eludes researchers all the time. It's very hard to actually nail things down and to know for sure what's the most important single ingredient in what you're doing. We keep trying to figure those out or figure more things out about that, but it's a very challenging kind of research. Now, I will mention something about these other two large studies in the U.S., and these are much larger. This Army study is a large study with a lot of money, and if these two studies had never been done, that would have been the largest. The Army study that I told you about would be the largest study in the history of the field of relationship education in a very rigorous kind of controlled trial. These are two studies that are very large, funded by the federal government, and they're very controversial in the U.S. And what I mean by controversial is researchers don't agree even on what the findings mean. And that happens a lot, and it happens in anything where people might disagree about whether to do something or not. But I will mention a couple of findings here. Building Strong Families is a 8-site study, large multi-sector, 8-site studies, not multi-sector, 8 sites, different cities, where they're working with unmarried couples who are having a child. So it's couples in the transition to parenthood who are unmarried, very low income. So very stressed, very low income couples. That's the Building Strong Family study. The Supporting Healthy Marriage study is all married couples, but also couples in poverty, very low income couples. Another 8-site study, 8 different sites around the country. And I'll briefly mention the findings for you. I think I have that on the next panel. And then you can read more about these. You can especially read more about this one, the BSF one, on my site. I have my blog is slidingversusdeciding.com. It's in your notes. But I have a large entry around the 1st of this year, early in January, criticizing a comment made by another researcher about the findings in the BSF study, which is very worth reading if you're interested in this area. But of the 8 sites, only Oklahoma had significant results across many dimensions at 15 months in the Building Strong Family study. And what's important to know about this study, the critics, what they'll tend to do is they average across all the 8 sites, and when you average across all the 8 sites, since only one of them got really significant results, the overall effect across all the 8 sites is to say that it didn't work, that it didn't have an effect. But in that study, only Oklahoma got most of the people into the services. Most of the other 7 sites had a dismal performance in terms of reducing barriers and encouraging people to come in. So many people, most people in the other 7 sites didn't get even one session of the training, or maybe only got one session of the training. Whereas in Oklahoma, 80%, 82% of their sample got about 20 hours of service. So they got much better results, and their findings, I think, mean something much more than the other sites. Very interesting, in the fall at 36 months, and this is the thing you can read more about in my blog if you want, they got another kind of finding related to family stability, which again I want to say, these are rare, very important sort of findings, that the couple, the families having a child in the intervention group in Oklahoma were more likely to have lived together continuously since their child was born at 3 years out than the control group, which is an amazing finding. In the SHM study, they're actually going to come out with 3-year results. At least they're going to tell some of us the 3-year results next week, so I'm sort of anxious to hear. But they've got modest results across the 8 sites in this study in the pre to post analyses, and all the sites in this study did very good job at getting couples into the services, because primarily they learned from what Oklahoma did in this earlier study. They learned about reducing barriers. Okay, a couple more things. It's important, I can tell you this is an important context in terms of thinking about studies that evaluate large programs. What happens to be true, and most people don't know this even in the United States, even though we do a lot of these studies, most large evaluations of government programs don't show hardly any positive results at all. It's really rare, actually, to get positive results. I have a colleague who's an expert at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, Kathy Eden, and she teaches graduate students on policy evaluations in the U.S. and the history of them. And she says they come in every year so starry-eyed and bright and excited and happy about, you know, what you can do with government and government policy. And she says they're so depressed by the end of the class because she has to show them all the studies. It's very hard to actually, in the most rigorous studies, to document results. So when you get results at all in the most rigorous kinds of designs, it's really important to pay attention to. But this also means that political will matters a lot. I believe in science. I do science for a living. It's an important part of my life, and I think it's very important. But a lot of times, as a people in a country or a culture, you have to decide, well, what's important? What do we value? And use science to help you improve what you do over time, but don't let science tell you what's important or whether you should be trying to do something that you know is important, because it can take a long time for the scientists to figure out what they need to figure out, and then you're never doing anything in the meantime. All right. Just a couple more comments. I mentioned this metaphor yesterday. I'll remind you of it again today to get to the last slide. It's very useful in this kind of work to think about both the trains, which are the services, the things you want to provide, and the tracks, which are the systems that you can use to reach people and reliably get to them and deliver the services. And as I said yesterday, ultimately the tracks matter more. PrEP and what we do with PrEP or other people's programs, those are trains. The tracks really matter more, because if you have good tracks over time, you can improve the trains. You can figure out better trains over time. And I will end with this slide, because it's my last slide, so that's convenient. There's many decisions to make when you think about it's generally true, you're going to get more impact with high-risk groups. But that doesn't mean you only want to work with them, maybe. There's many different things that you have to decide based on how you work. You can do different levels of prevention. Universal means you'll take anybody. You try to reach everybody. Anybody that you can get to walk in the door, you want to give them this service. There's good arguments for doing universal prevention efforts in terms of relationship enhancement and education. Selective means that you know that this group is at high risk, but they may not be showing any signs of difficulty yet in their life. But they're at higher risk. So for example, maybe their parents didn't stay together. Maybe their parents never married. Maybe the father was never around. Maybe they've had a difficult adolescent period and gotten in a lot of trouble, and there's other kinds of risks coming from that in terms of their history. So you can figure out they're at higher risk, but they're not really necessarily showing the problem yet that you're most interested in preventing. And indicated means there are already evidence that they're struggling. There's already evidence that in this case, that a couple maybe is having more difficulty or is not doing so well. So you can do any of these approaches. Sometimes, like in the SHM and BSF studies, they targeted high-risk groups. They really wanted to seek out and work with couples in poverty because they know that that's a big risk. And generally, especially by the SHM study, all the sites, very effective. In the SHM study, and this is an amazing finding by itself, the average couple ended up participating in 27 hours of service. And if you think about how stressed a family is in poverty, how much is on them, how much is against them, all the barriers, for them to come and like it so much and want to keep coming and to come for that much is it's an extraordinary finding no matter what else in that study. Last point I'll make is the question's always important. Should we screen or not for risk? Should we try to interview people or give people a test or something that tells us who's at higher risk and just work with them or not? Sometimes you're making these decisions based on resources. My general tendency is I think it's very valuable to do two kinds of things. One is where you decide a particular group, you know they're high risk, and you're going to reach them, and you're going to try very hard to reach them because they're selected or indicated, and you're tailoring maybe your services for them. That's a very great way to go. But I also am a big believer in universal services where you have something that's available for everybody, and you invite everybody, and you encourage everybody to come on because without screening, because I think many times people will get there because that's the door they could walk through. You might have people then in that room that need many other services. They might need help with finances. They might need help with aggression. They might need help with substance abuse or something else. Who knows what they might need help with, but if that's the door they could walk through, that's your starting point. Now you have them in the room and you're building trust with them and a relationship with them, and you can introduce them to other services. You can educate them about other things that exist that maybe they just never knew about, that service even existed, and you can help them line up. So all of these are viable strategies. The key thing is to think clearly, what are we trying to do in this effort to reach who, and what methods are we going to use to do that? Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
好，我们谢谢Scott Stanley 哈。其实刚刚我们听过了我们主讲者的演讲之后，我第一个反应我第一个想法就是还好那时候我爸爸妈妈的那个时代没有这个 program， 不然我就不会嫁给这个先生，有这么好的孩子，因为他们可能对于在这样子一个高风险的家庭里面，他们可以接受得很好，所以呢，他也不会反对我这样子继续交往哈，所以觉得还好哈。那当然了，所以其实透过今天的这个演讲，我们也知道有几件事情在做我们学术或者是在做很多我们现在在推动方案里面，其实有一件事情是值得我们思考的，就是我们现在常常在做方案执行完了之后，大概很多的我们县市中心的这个执行者通常会做一件事情，就是做完之后会做一个什么 feedback， 对不对？可是那个 feedback 是当下的，通常我们没有做 continue 的一个了解，所以他的研究到底这样的 feedback 是可以持续的，还是只是短暂的？其实我们常常讲说它的影响可能只是短暂几天几个月，可是这一个研究我们看到的是持续下去对于家庭的影响，所以或许我们希望有更多这样子的研究，帮助我们在做未来的推动里面有更好的一些 program 就要更好的计划让我们来执行。另外呢，我想提到的就是有一个最简单的一个回应其实在这一次的2天的会议里面Scott 给我们很多的建议，其中他最喜欢用的就是 train 就是那个火车。他提到说火车其实火车很重要，可是这个铁轨更重要，因为铁轨会带着火车到我们要去服务的对象那个地方，所以那个 outreach 就是我们要怎么样去找到这些我们需要帮助的人。那我觉得这是很重要。那我也提供另外一个 Scott 他的一些看法。我过去应该是说这一年是我 sabbatical 的1年哈，所以我在美国待的时间蛮长的。那我上个礼拜才从 Indianapolis 回来，那我在那边是做一个 full-time mom。我这样子说啊，因为大部分时间陪我的孩子。那在那边我就花了一些时间看电视，我发现，我觉得这个概念我一定要跟大家分享。是在那边我看很多美国人，他们很重视一件事情，什么事情呢 ？remodel 他们的房子，他们有他们的 dream house， 他们 dream house 里面这一个观念跟我们完全不一样的地方是什么呢？那个是什么？那就是 kitchen。他们认为 kitchen 是整个家庭里面最重要的地方。为什么呢？他认为 kitchen 是一个家庭的 heart， 是一个他心脏。因为在那个地方呢，全家人和 get together 一起做一些事情，一起分享事情，所以他们有一个概念叫 open concept， 把 kitchen 打开，不要把我们的女性躲在厨房里面，或者做饭的人躲在厨房里面，而是可以走出去跟大家一起互动，让家庭能够凝聚在一起。我觉得这是很棒。那当然，这个概念是从谁来呢？从 design 设计的人。那设计人如果他有一个很好的设计，使用的人他就可以有做很好的一个使用方式。设计人是谁呢？其实就是我们的政府。如果可以在我们的政策里面做一个很好的设计的时候，其实所有的使用，我们的 kitchen 就可以做很好的使用。所以这个最后用一个我为什么用 Scott 的概念，是因为我在美国看到的那个秀，他的主持人是 Scott。所以同样虽然都是这个不一样的一个概念，但是呢，我觉得它的原则是一样的，所以跟大家分享一下我在美国这几天这一段时间当一个 full-time mom 的心得哈。那同时也回应Scott 今天的一个演讲。好，那最后因为大会呢也准备了一个感谢状，要给那个 Scott 今天给我们的一个很精彩的演讲哈。那这个是。
好，让我们掌声谢谢 Dr. Scott Stanley， 还有唐先梅博士。